All right, thanks everybody for attending LAWCHA's Pandemic Book Talk series. Tonight, we have Alex Finley, she's at the University of Pittsburgh currently, and we're gonna discuss her book, An Intimate Economy, Enslaved Women, Work, and the Domestic Slave Trade. And I wanna just give people briefly an idea of how this works. We're gonna, after a brief introduction, we'll turn it over to Alex and she will discuss her book for approximately a half an hour. And then once she's done, we'll open it up for a Q&A and people can post their questions while Alex is talking in the chat box. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the chat box is located at the bottom of your screen. You hit the icon and the chat box will appear on the right-hand side of the screen. And you can post your questions in there, post them to everyone. And I'll read them off and ask you to unmute if we have time, and you can ask your question directly. And Alex will answer, and and then we'll go to 8 o'clock or so, and we'll try to keep it on time as best we can. So I have a few brief announcements before we go ahead and get started. I just want to say that this is brought to you by the Labor and Working Class History Association, aka LAWCHA. I'll be posting some announcements in the chat box as we go ahead and get started. So I'll be letting you know about the upcoming talks. Our next talk features Toni Gilpin. She'll be discussing The Long Deep Grudge, a story of big capital, radical labor, and class war in the American heartland. And that's going to take place on February 18th. And then we have a few more talks lined up. And we're gonna go through, so this is the new bit. We're planning currently on going through the summer and into the fall. We feel like this has been a useful format for folks who have their books coming out, and that this is a way for us all to get together. And we have to look forward to, even though we can be in person, this is also a good way to reduce our carbon footprint as we're supporting one another. So we feel like this is a worthwhile endeavor to continue, and we hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Alex and she can begin talking about her book.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you everyone for showing up and for listening to me talk about my book. I'm going to do something a little different and share my screen, or at least try to share my screen here. So you're probably going to see some slides from my class while I'm getting this set up here. Let's see, share screen. Okay. Okay, and oh, nope, that's wrong. I'm sorry. Okay. Share screen, let's try this again. Share. All right, is everyone seeing an appropriate title now? Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, thank you for your patience there. So like I said, thank you everyone so much for coming and for giving me a chance to talk about An Intimate Economy. And overall, you know, it explores the lives of women caught in the domestic slave trade. And I use 4 personal histories to illustrate the importance of women's socially reproductive labor, which I'll get into more later in the talk. But I wanted to start today with a story for several reasons. First, because it's a Zoom talk. And, you know, I think anything I can do to make it more interesting for you is something that I want to do. And second, I think it's important when we talk about the histories, particularly of enslaved individuals and of people who are often silenced in the archives, that we talk in as much detail and with as much nuance as possible. Too often, enslaved men and women are presented as kind of an undifferentiated mass of people. And one of the goals of my book was to make that history personal. So the documents that I draw on in the book offer the rare window to tell the story of individual women under slavery, and in some instances, even to hear their voices. So I wanted to kind of do justice to the history of these women I write about, and to tell their stories as vividly and as accurately as possible, considering their actions, their labor, their positions, their choices, and their lack of choices. So I want to share one of those stories with you today, while also kind of referencing the broader arguments of the book. But I really wanted to place the history of one enslaved woman at the center of the presentation, kind of to show that I think her individual story is more significant than any historiographic intervention that I may make. And I wanted to share too as many primary sources as possible. I wanted to show through the PowerPoint the documents that have allowed me to tell this story so you can interpret them and analyze them for yourself. And just to kind of get a sense of what kind of documents do remain to tell the histories of enslaved women. And I wanted to point out too, right, that none of these documents were easy to locate or access. Unfortunately, the places that are most able to offer funding for researchers are not always the places that are best suited for telling the histories of non-elite people. So in some ways, the funding structure of the archive, of what institutions get donations or funding and are thus able to offer fellowships and grants to researchers, sometimes reproduce some of the inequalities of the 19th century. So a lot of what you're seeing today comes from the New Orleans Public Library, which is a real treasure trove of resources. And I was lucky enough to get funding from my graduate institution to go there. But without that, I likely wouldn't have been able to find anything that I'm about to show you because the library itself doesn't receive a lot of funding and can't kind of give that out to researchers to come visit. So with all that being said, I'll kind of turn to the story at hand. So it was late 1887 when Mary Lumpkin received an unexpected knock on her door. A man who she didn't know stood outside, likely holding a stack of papers in his hand. Upon greeting him, she discovered that he came on behalf of the county court near where she lived in New Richmond, Ohio. It was unclear if the man, whose name was L.M. Dawson, knew anything of Mary's history or if he considered her black or white or some other racial classification. We also don't know from the records what Mary made of this strange white man stopping by her home and asking many questions about a longtime friend of hers, who she learned from the clerk was now dead. Her friend's name was Lucy Cheatham, and she had recently died in New Orleans. Mary had known Lucy since before the Civil War, since they'd both lived in Richmond, Virginia, and then later when Lucy and Mary had both relocated to New Orleans, where they had lived together. In between these times when they were physically together, the two women had regularly exchanged letters to one another and to members of each other's family, sometimes sending gifts or small sums of money. So now there was a man who was claiming to be one of these family members who was suing Lucy's estate, claiming that he deserved the majority of her remaining assets as her only legitimate child. So the man that Mary was talking to, the clerk, wanted to question her as a witness in the court case over Lucy's estate, and he carried with him a commission from the Court of Orleans Parish. So Mary answered the questions that he asked her, but in doing so, she had to be careful. She knew too well that the prying eyes of white men in the legal system could bring about great harm. She had to protect Lucy's legacy, and she had to protect Lucy's children. So Mary told Dawson a particular story about her old friend's life. Lucy, Mary told him, had been born in Virginia and was living in Richmond when she met Mary. She was staying at Mr. Betts's place, and the two women visited one another and sewed together. Sometime shortly after, Lucy moved to New Orleans, where she quickly married a man named John Hagan. Mary told Dawson that she had received a letter from Lucy stating that she had married, and that was how she knew that her friends had married Hagan. They had 4 children together, two of whom survived to adulthood, 1 son and 1 daughter. She had never been married before or after, and she had no other children. After Hagan died and after the Civil War, Mary left Richmond and went to New Orleans to stay for a while with Lucy, where Lucy made a living renting out furnished rooms. Mary denied that the man suing the estate was in fact Lucy's legitimate son. So that's kind of the official story that survives in the record of what Mary told the courts about her friend's death and her friend's family. But buried behind this neat narrative of Mary's was an all too common tale of an enslaved woman forced into concubinage by a slave trader, likely in the context of the so-called fancy trade or the sale of young enslaved women for sex. When Mary said that Lucy was staying at Mr. Betts's, she kept from Dawson, the clerk, the fact that Mr. Betts was actually William H. Betts, a slave trader, and that Lucy was not staying with him, but was jailed by him in his Richmond slave jail. Mary never revealed to the clerk that Lucy or her children had ever been enslaved. Nowhere in the court record did anyone ever refer to the family's past in slavery or to Lucy's racial identity. Mary was certainly not going to reveal such sensitive information, as she too had a past in slavery and concubinage. So how had Mary and Lucy come into contact? Through some means, Lucy and Mary, like so many enslaved women, became friends through the task of sewing, whether for Mary's family or for the other enslaved people in the jail. Mary was not in jail with Lucy, but she lived not far from William H. Betts' slave jail at Lumpkin's slave jail, an illustration of which you see here. Slave jails were privately owned jails where slave traders imprisoned enslaved people before sale and sometimes punished enslaved people for a fee. So Mary and her family lived in the same complex as one of these jails, which was known among the enslaved people of Richmond as the Devil's Half Acre. And the father of Mary's children was a different Richmond slave trader named Robert Lumpkin. So Betts, Lumpkin, and men like them were professional slave traders, men who made their living through the purchase and sale of enslaved men, women, and children. And far from social outcasts, these men advertised widely, they had business connections with local elites, received large loans from banks, and occasionally even served in political office. Another slave trader who they did business with was John Hagan, a wealthy partner in a tri-state firm based in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Virginia, who purchased Lucy Cheatham from William H. Betts. So this was why she had ended up in New Orleans, not because she had simply chosen to travel there, as Mary had implied to the clerk of court, but because she had been sold there. This is an image, a drawing from 1862 of what one such slave jail may have looked like, and an actual image of one from the same time period. Sorry. So Lucy was forced on board a ship, the Cyane, and transported to New Orleans. And this made her part of a larger trade known as the domestic or the internal slave trade, as opposed to the Atlantic slave trade. So in 1808, the United States had outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, though it continued to a lesser extent illegally. What replaced the transatlantic slave trade for the most part was the domestic slave trade, or the sale of enslaved people from the upper South to the lower South. So many slaveholders, certainly but not all, sold enslaved people to states such as Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana for the expanding cotton economy of the Deep South. So as white Americans moved into the region, they looked to purchase enslaved laborers, which led to the domestic slave trade, which was at its largest in the 1830s and relied on these broader merchant and banking networks that I mentioned earlier, and men like Lumpkin, Betts, and Hagan. You can kind of see the extent of their advertising and their professionalization in these images from the Richmond Inquirer. And they also relied on transportation infrastructure, right? Boats, turnpikes, and later railroads. So in Lucy's case, Hagan transported her by water around the tip of Florida and into the port of New Orleans. Because the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed, American ports required manifests such as the one you see here to be carried by each slave trading vessel. So it's only due to the creation of such records that we can track Lucy's transport. And they were also often used in insurance cases. You can see here the reference to Lucy and Cheatham. And her physical description in the manifest, she's young, she's listed as mulatto, made her susceptible to the fancy trade. So traders identified so-called fancies and considered them good investments as they sold them for very high prices. You can see in this account book from another Richmond slave trader who knew Lumpkin and Hagan and Betts, named Silas Omohundro, where he had designated 4 women, Maria Johnson, Fanny, Columbia, and Mariah as fancies in his account book. So all these women were valued as highly, if not more, than the other enslaved people he listed. So during a public auction of enslaved people, traders might use specific language or material markers to clue buyers into the fact that this was a woman being sold for sex, or they might be more direct in how they described an individual in an auction. In Lucy's case, Hagen decided not to auction her off in his auction rooms, but decided to keep her for himself. So Lucy ended up at Hagen's slave trading compound on Esplanade Street, marked here on the map within the red section to the right. And the squares indicate where the slave trade was concentrated in the city. And New Orleans was the largest slave market in the country at the time. So this was what Mary meant when she said that Lucy wrote to her saying that she was married. And one of the things that I wish more than anything else that I knew from my research that I could answer was what exactly Lucy said to Mary in that letter, right? How could she have explained such a situation to her friend? But whatever she said, Mary likely would have understood quite well because she was in the same position. So this is census records showing where John Hagen is living in New Orleans. He's living with his brother. There were 3 brothers involved in the firm together. And there you can see too that they're living next to fellow slave traders. They tended to concentrate in neighborhoods around one another. And Hagen lived on Esplanade Street in a compound that included a private home and a jail and auction rooms. So Lucy now found herself living in a home that was also many other businesses, right? Also a boarding house, it was also a slave jail. It was similar to the one she had been imprisoned in. And nearby, there were even more similar structures. So other women in Lucy's position were tasked with running the household and boarding portion of the residence in the jail. And there are other women in similar situations who I talk about in the book. And it's likely that Lucy, especially given her profession later on, that she played a similar role for Hagen, because slave traders were like to advertise not just their jails to potential purchasers and other traders visiting the city, but also that they offered board for the traders themselves. As you can see in this ad from 1848, it's clearly called a slave yard and boarding house. And here's an example of a bill from Karina Omohundro, an enslaved woman who had children with Silas Omohundro, whose account book you saw just a little bit earlier. So noted in the fee are several goods that she purchased for the men boarding, as well as almost 4 months of washing. And washing obviously was considered women's work and often enslaved women's work at that. So men relied on the women they enslaved to keep their boarding houses functioning and making money, as you can see here with this reference on the side to Mrs. Omohundro's bill. They also turned to women's labor in the jails. So traders generally tried to improve the appearance of enslaved people before sale. They increased their rations, gave them bathing time, issued new suits of clothes, they called sale outfits, and employed tricks like oil on the skin or trying to cover up gray hairs. And the cost of all of this, they factored into the bill of sale or charged for it outright. So here's an example of a receipt from one such bill from Robert Lumpkin, who was the father of Mary Lumpkin's children. So these primary sources and this example of Cheatham's role in Hagen's household speaks to my broader argument about the many forms of women's labor: reproductive, socially reproductive, sexual, emotional. And while I use the antebellum slave trade and these 4 case studies as a lens through which to view these forms of labor, my argument is for the overall importance of this type of work. So reproductive labor forms the foundation of all other types of work and wealth. And without it, there are no workers, people aren't prepared for work each day, society can't function on a daily basis. But because this work has historically been performed by women, and especially by women of color, because it's often not always performed outside of the market economy, people then and often people today tend to disregard its importance and overlook its importance to economic markets. So in the book, I use the histories of women like Lucy Cheatham to illustrate in personal and specific ways the importance of this kind of work. While it exists across societies and it's visible in many forms, I wanted to focus on its function in the antebellum slave trade, because in the trade in human beings, we can see in really stark, crude, and horrifying ways the values that societies put on reproductive labor in all its forms. So the women I write about created profit for slave traders through further caring for people sold as commodities. They sewed clothes, they nursed, they birthed babies, prepared food, laundered linens, ran boarding houses, and so on and so forth. And without them, the slave trade wouldn't have functioned as it did. And from there, we can connect these women's labor and the value that they and other enslaved people created from the antebellum South across the globe through cotton commodity chains and credit. Three of the four women I focus on in the book were, like Cheatham, the enslaved concubines of the men who held them in slavery. And this is a significant part of my argument because I focus in one chapter on the fancy trade, but it's also important because I wanted to pull together the links in ideology and action between domestic work, intimate space, and sexual violence. I also want to briefly discuss the types of work that women such as Cheatham performed and the very real role that it played in slave traders' businesses. So what did it mean to run a boarding house or prepare a sale outfit? In a jail compound like Hagen's, there were generally two sections. One that was a jail for enslaved people awaiting sale, and one that was the slave traders' residence and boarding house. So in the jail, enslaved men and women received the types of preparation for sale that I mentioned earlier. While men undertook some of this work, particularly for other enslaved men, slave traders often had enslaved male assistants for this. Much of the other work fell to women, particularly when it came to laundering, food preparation, and sewing. So to focus in a little bit more on the sewing, slave traders usually gave enslaved people sale outfits, or two generic-looking suits of clothing to wear during an auction or a private sale. And these outfits looked very similar to one another. They were cheaply made out of coarse but clean material, and the outfit was so ubiquitous that in court cases over debts in terms of sale, slave traders refer to the material in terms such as, quote, such as is usually used in sale. So these outfits serve many purposes. They mark the individual wearing them as for sale, as a commodity. They attempted to erase individual identity on the auction block, and they allowed the trader and potential purchaser to project their own fantasies onto the individual enslaved person. They were factored into the cost of jailing and commission, part of a standard business practice of traders and their agents. So they could also be modified to attest to particular advertised attributes. So like I mentioned earlier, briefly, a woman being sold as a fancy girl, for instance, would often have on accessories or outfits made of richer fabric to signify that she was supposed to perform a different type of labor than an agricultural laborer. And the production of these outfits could take place in a number of ways. Some were likely constructed by hand from purchased fabric, such as the quote unquote Negro cloth produced specifically for the Southern market in Northern factories, but others, especially men's clothing, may have been purchased ready-made. But ready-made is a bit of a misleading term, as even ready-made items required modification and finishing to fit a particular individual's body. And so in each of these scenarios, right, the clothes required some further stitching to actually be worn. And it was women that performed this work, whether it's the work of finishing or whether it's the work of cutting and stitching both. So slave traders turned to a variety of women to perform this work. Their wives, daughters, nieces, sisters, mothers, enslaved women, the enslaved women who were also the mothers of their children, like Lucy Cheatham, and sometimes women waiting for sale in their jails. So in some cases, enslaved women were put to work sewing towards their own commoditization, forced to make their own sale outfits while they waited in jail. So a contemporary description of one major trading firm of Franklin and Armfield's jail in Alexandria, for instance, mentioned a specific section of the jail set apart for clothing production. So you have kind of this business side that women are involved in, but enslaved women's labor was also crucial to the functioning of the slave traders' personal households and boarding houses. Even if a man's name was on the license for a boarding house, or a man was designated as the head of household for a boarding house on the census, as they often were, the day-to-day responsibilities of running such an establishment usually fell to women. And I think sometimes today it's easy to forget or minimize the demanding physical work that went into running a boarding house. So it meant providing the board or food, sweeping, cleaning rugs, dusting, changing linens, marketing, planning meals, maybe removing bed bugs, maybe doing laundry probably for an extra fee, providing oil for lamps and wood for fire, cleaning windows, appeasing difficult customers, all of these things, right? So it also meant a decent amount of emotional labor. Renters wanted a landlady who offered all the emotional comforts of home and attempted to recreate the role of a female family member, however tainted by the market a landlady may have been. And so in their testimony and court cases I've looked at, boarders clearly still valued having a landlady who had these kind of same emotional attributes that they expected from female relatives for free. So Lucy likely had a role, certainly in the personal household, but likely in the slave jail as well. So Cheatham provided these many forms of labor for Hagan, and she also bore him 4 children and raised those children in their household, which she did until his death in 1856. Now, before his death, Hagan had specified in his will that Lucy, their daughter, and any future children should be free. So note here where I've underlined that he specifically refers to his daughter as Dolly here. In an earlier draft of the will, Hagan had claimed that he freed Cheatham because she had cared for him during an illness. And this is very telling. Enslavers often cloak the nature of their ties to women such as Cheatham in the language of domesticity and care work, eliding sexual violence with references to nursing, as Hagan did in his first will. In the later draft that you see here, he said that she provided a sufficient sum to purchase herself. And laws surrounding emancipation in Louisiana were constantly changing, and this likely is why he changed the wording in his will. Just 1 year later, the state legislature outlawed emancipation altogether. So besides their freedom, the will also stipulated that Lucy and the children received the house on Esplanade, some furniture, and $10,000, which was not an inconsequential amount, but it was much less than he left his white relatives. And he died a very wealthy man with only a sliver of the fortune going to Cheatham and their children together. But Lucy and her 2 surviving children carried on. She took on the skills she had used in Hagan's boarding house and jail and employed them for her own benefit, housing the various merchants and businessmen who frequented the city. So you can see here in 1860, she still had a pretty good sum of money on personal property and real estate. And you'll also note that if you look at the residents of the house, there's no Dolly. There's 4 boarders, Lucy, her son William, and a Frederica. So Frederica was Dolly with her new, or perhaps her original but secret name. So while Hagan apparently believed his daughter's name was Dolly, Lucy had actually named her daughter Frederica, and Frederica Bremer at that, who was a European author popular for her fiction, but also famous for her views about women's rights and slavery. And she'd even toured New Orleans a little bit before the time of Hagan's birth, writing scathingly of the city's slave jail. So in this one small discrepancy between what John Hagan thought his daughter's name was and what Lucy Cheatham thought her name was, I think we can see a glimpse of Lucy's personality, her resistance to slavery, and her assertion of her own identity and humanity. So Cheatham continued to assert this personal identity and follow her own dreams when in 1860, she tore down the slave jail on Esplanade. She took her money, and she also borrowed quite a bit, which would come back to haunt her, to build a new home, which was literally made from the ruins of her old life. And this structure still stands, shown here in some modern variants of its original condition. And she used some of the bricks and some of the materials from the torn down slave jail to rebuild a home for herself and her children. But unfortunately for Lucy, the start of the Civil War and all the money that she borrowed meant financial disaster by 1863. And so her bankruptcy records are another reason that I can tell her story today. But despite all of this, Lucy survived the Civil War and bankruptcy and started over a second time, going back into business, renting out furnished rooms. She spent a significant amount of her remaining money on Frederica's education, paying for her to attend a private girls' school in New York, where her peers likely thought she was white. Lucy remade much of her fortune and actually died a fairly wealthy woman, which may explain why someone pretended to be her true heir in court. So Lucy died in the 1880s at the house of one of her friends, someone who she had known like Mary Lumpkin for several decades and who had lived with her for a while in New Orleans. And she's buried in Cypress Grove Cemetery just outside the city. So it was the testimony of Lucy's friends, Mary Lumpkin, as well as others, like the home of the woman, or the woman whose home she died at. And many of these women were had been enslaved women as well. It was this testimony that guaranteed her children would inherit her estate. They all faithfully recounted the details of Lucy's life, or at least those they wanted the courts to know, to people in Ohio, Virginia, and Louisiana. And not a single one ever mentioned that Lucy Cheatham had been enslaved. So I think what this story can tell us, I think it can tell us a lot of things. I think it's incredibly valuable in and of itself, but it also points to broader pieces of the history of slavery in the United States. I think it highlights the importance of women's reproductive and socially reproductive labor, not only, but especially within antebellum slavery. It points to the commodification of enslaved women's bodies and sexuality. There were many ways that white people imagined they could make money off of women of African descent, and there were many forms of labor that went into those imaginings. And it all illustrates that the most violent and devastating aspects of slavery could be the most personal. These were not intermittent explosions of extreme violence, but intimate, daily, repeated assaults of women's most intimate lives, her body, her home, her children. I think that Lucy's friendship with Mary is also a testament to the power of female friendship as a tool of resistance against slavery. Such instances are incredibly difficult to document clearly, and the testimony of Mary Lumpkin, I think, is really extraordinary in what it shows. Though the evidence may not always be so clear, I'm willing to bet that Lucy and Mary were not the only women to sustain themselves through such a friendship, which kind of relates to my broadest point for my talk today, which is that the archives were not made with women like Lucy and Mary in mind, but nonetheless, there are instances where kind of unbidden and unwanted, their voices emerge and survive nonetheless. So that is all I have for you. Thank you. I will stop screen sharing now.
Okay. We can all use your, if you would like, you can use, as some of you already have, your little emojis to give Alex a hand, and we're going to go ahead and move on to the question and answer. We'll probably run this for about a half hour-ish, so we're going to go a little bit over time. So the first question is from Thurman Wenzel, and Thurman, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, hi. I'm recalling that Frederick Douglass learned to write as sort of a teenage babysitter in Baltimore. I'm guessing that these women must have learned to write in Richmond, but I'm curious whether you've dug out any details. I presume it was uncommon for so-called fancy women to be able to write. Do we know any more about that?
Yeah, thank you. So I unfortunately don't know anything more about Lucy's case individually and Mary's case individually, but in another instance that I looked at of the woman Karina, whose boarding bill I showed on one of the slides, the man who enslaved her, Silas Omohundro, actually paid someone to teach her to read and write. And so there are entries in his account book that say to tutor for Karina, and she at this point had several children. She was an adult, but she learned to read and write to the degree that she later participated in court cases and was able to sign her name and kind of participate legally. So I wouldn't be surprised if, maybe if not Robert Lumpkin himself maybe taught Mary. I know he was involved with some of the churches in Richmond that had particular classes for enslaved people or Bible studies for enslaved people. So that's kind of the best that I can guess, but I don't have a specific example.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, we're waiting on our next round of, okay, here we go. Christopher Thal, will you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
All right. I'm curious about the ways in which these young women learn their skills. It seems to me, I was struck with the idea that they were taking what you described as sort of prefabricated men's clothes and fixing them up somewhat. And I was thinking tailoring is something that's more common a skill than some other skills we could name, but it takes some doing to learn to do that. I certainly wouldn't want to try it. And on the other hand, cooking is something that takes some time and so on, much more common, but I'm curious about how these skills or maybe other skills that are relevant here were learned.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with cooking. I know, like, for instance, for women on larger plantations, a lot of times the cook would train her children or female relatives or male relatives sometimes to take her place. In terms of sewing, this is kind of part of my second project that I'm interested in. You see a lot of advertisements in Southern papers for enslaved women for sale with specific mentions to the ability to sew, and not just to sew, but very specific, like ability to cut or ability to finish garments. So they're kind of differentiating what their skill level is and what their specialty is. Also ironing, different types of laundry, fine sewing is sometimes mentioned. And in some cases, some women seem to have gone to one another to be trained. So if there was someone in the neighborhood or the city or a relative who could train them, who also had similar skills. In one case that I read about, or I heard actually in another conference paper, one slaveholder actually sent an enslaved woman away to be trained in garment making. So I think that it was a bit of formal and informal exchange and training, but that's the fact that slaveholders were very cognizant of this is a particular skill set, and particularly one for women, and something that they advertised and marketed, is something that I want to pursue further.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and, while we're waiting for other folks to ask some questions, I would like you to talk a little bit more about your experience in the archives, and how it was that you found the documents that you did, and how much you had to go through to unearth them.
Yeah, thank you. That's one of my favorite things to talk about, because I love a good archive story or a good archival adventure. It all started with Omohundro's account book, which is at the Library of Virginia, and I showed you an image of, and that was kind of the beginning of the project in my archival muse early on, and I transcribed the whole thing and kind of tried to make different categories. How much money was he spending on food? How much was he spending on clothing? And obviously noticing all of these payments going to women. So that was kind of how I started the project. And from there, it was a bit of a question of, well, as my committee members, Scott and Cindy, know, it was a bit of a journey to the final project. But essentially what happened was I was looking at business networks of slave traders, and they all knew each other. They all were friends with one another, had made deals with one another. And through looking more into them, I started to realize that so many of them had relationships with women like Karina, that they were enslaved women who had their children and who ran their households. And so just by looking into their business papers, and then by looking into things like their wills and their estates, that was how I found a lot of other individuals. That's how I found Lucy Cheatham. And just looking in their account books and kind of noticing all of the payments made to women. So it's a bit of kind of a treasure hunt of looking for individual women's names in these records that were made for other purposes. And it took me a lot of places, and I can keep going. I could keep going for a long time, but I'll stop now.
So we have a question here from Eileen Boris. Eileen, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love this work, as you know. And rather than ask about social reproduction today, I want to ask about the way in which your findings recalibrate or shift our understandings of the financialization of slavery. Because I think there's profound implications from what you found.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think I think what it shows is that we have to kind of expand our understanding of the economic and markets, and think about things beyond kind of sheer numbers, and think about value in a much broader sense, and labor and production in a much broader sense. You know, the women who I'm writing about weren't necessarily valued or advertised for doing the types of work that I think we most often think about slavery, that we think about, right? They're not kind of connected to cotton or kind of tobacco or agricultural production, which I think is the most common connection with the links between the economy, and slavery. And I think we have to think more expansively and more deeply, particularly in gendered ways, about how different types of care work could also add value, right? They're not kind of traditional economic questions, but I think they kind of need to be, that they change the way we think about the production of value and people's role in the economy.
Okay, our next question comes from Laura Vapnik. Laura, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself there?
Hi. So thank you. This was a great presentation. And I am going to ask a question about reproductive labor, which is, I'm curious about where the slave mistresses are in this story. And maybe I'm asking that question because my framework is more thinking about, you know, commodity production and like the traditional plantation, and thinking about some recent scholarship by people like Stephanie Jones Rogers, you know, who really emphasize the role that slave mistresses played in terms of, you know, kind of managing and exploiting the reproductive labor of enslaved women. And so I'm really just curious about where, you know, what the white women were doing in this story who are part of the household. Are they, you know, managing the labor? Are they, you know, what are they doing themselves, and sort of like, what are they delegating?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So particularly for the case of Cheatham and really all of the women I write in detail about, there were no white women in the household. But in other cases that I looked at of slave traders' families who did have white families, the women are also very involved. So my work, I think, really aligns with Stephanie Jones Rogers in that way, that the women, the wives, the daughters, sisters, even mothers of slave traders are equally involved in the trade, and they write back to one another about kind of the details of sale, and they give business advice to their husbands or their fathers. So they're just as invested and involved in the system, and in some cases managing labor. So there are some examples I have of daughters of slave traders who are kind of commanding the enslaved women on the plantation to sew sale outfits for the slave trader who's currently away, and writing about, you know, but she writes it as though she's the one doing the labor, but then it becomes clear later on in the letter that she's actually just telling the enslaved women to sew these particular dresses. In other cases, there are wives and other female relatives who are doing the work themselves, who are sewing, who are also sewing sale dresses. So yeah, they're certainly involved in the production and the management both.
Okay, our next question comes from Cindy Hamovich. Cindy?
Hey, Alex, thanks so much for your talk. That was really fascinating. I want to ask you again a question that I think I asked you early on in the dissertation process, and that's how the project has changed your understanding of the slave traders themselves, and how were they understood in the society? I mean, some of these men were really wealthy, clearly, but were they considered respectable elites, or was there a sort of taint on them even among their white financial peers.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's so. I think the biggest distinction that I can make is that it really depended on the type of trader. So if someone was a very wealthy, successful trader, like an Omohundro or a John Hagan or a Hector Davis in Richmond, they were not viewed with much opprobrium by anyone. I think they were accepted. You know, Hector Davis did a lot of business with banks. He started his own bank that had wealthy merchants from Richmond on the board. Isaac Franklin, you know, becomes a plantation owner. So there are instances of really successful slave traders kind of moving up in society, so to speak, or participating in more elite circles. I think the distinction is the trader's agents. And I think there where you get the kind of the character like the, you know, the, I'm blanking now, but the Uncle Tom's Cabin slave trader kind of character. And I think that's where that comes from. And I think it's more about the type of work that they were doing and the nature of the work than about the slave trade itself. That there were men like Hagan and Lumpkin, maybe less Lumpkin, but certainly like Hagan and Omohundro, who kind of commanded labor and who had men under them who kind of did the actual quote unquote dirty work of the trade. And I think it's those men who were kind of like hirelings who were more looked down on, I think, because of the nature of their work. And there's even a reference, I think it's Theodore Weld, who even writes, you know, that there's this observation that this family in South Carolina, you know, they're very wealthy, they're involved in the slave trade, but that's fine. You know, it's only their underlings who are kind of doing the manual labor that have this stigma attached to them. So I think that's kind of how I came to conceive of it as the project went on.
Thanks.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Our next question is from Bob Kortstadt. Bob?
Thanks, Dave. Mac, I'm sorry. So Alex, great talk and really sophisticated analysis of all kind of different issues and great use of archives too. So one question that Jacqueline and I had, we're looking at this together, did these women use these sewing skills and maybe some of the other skills that they had to, you know, adorn themselves, identify themselves, you know, and their children, and kind of an assertion of their status and their expertise and stuff? I mean, is that something that they did?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think so. Unfortunately, I don't have as many details as I'd like to answer you. I know in the case of Lucy Cheatham, she did send materials, money, and clothing back to her family who remained enslaved in Richmond, and she sent them via Mary Lumpkin. So there's some sort of sense of family network there that she was maintaining via these material objects in her sewing. In the case of Karina Omohundro, who I have more information about because there's a whole account book that Silas Omohundro kept, there are tons of references in there to different dresses that she had, to, you know, kidskin gloves, to boots, to dentures, to parasols. And one of the things I tried to think about a lot was kind of what that would mean to her, right? Like, what did it mean for an enslaved woman who was enslaved by a slave trader to be walking around Richmond in these very expensive dresses that she very regularly got, and then to go and do marketing and, you know, were places where she had book credit in Omohundro's name, kind of what might that have meant to her to have those material goods and to kind of assert her identity in that way. And I can't say for sure, but I think that it's I think it's an interesting just thing to think about, right? Like what that may have meant for her and what people may have thought when they saw her dressed as she was.
Okay, our next question is from Sarah Thomas. Sarah?
I'm curious about Lucy Cheatham, or Cheatham. Alex, how did you find her and how did you decide to frame a chapter around her? Also want to say thank you for your talk.
Thank you. Yeah, so I found Lucy it was interesting how finding one woman or one slave trader would kind of lead me to the next through all of their business and sometimes their family networks. So I found her just because I was looking at slave traders in all of the different kind of major cities in the South and looking at their business connections. And I found that the Higgins brothers had done business with Lumpkin, with Omohundro, with all the men in Richmond. And so I just started just to see, because I had this hunch, because it kept happening, that if I looked at their estate records, there was going to be somebody suing somebody about the settlement of their wills and the distribution of their estates. And lo and behold, there's this whole, well, there's actually not much of a battle in comparison over Hagen's estate, but there is his will, right, that references Lucy Cheatham and the emancipation. And so that was how I found out about her. And then just kind of by accident, while I was doing all the research I could on her, I found her her estate records, which is not quite as common, right? Like it was more common to find the estate records of the men than for the women to have estates, but she did have one. And I'm like scanning through and I'm reading and it's fascinating. And I'm like, who is this guy who's suing this state? Is he really her son? How does this fit in? And then I see Mary Lumpkin. And I've already done all this research on Omohundro and the Lumpkin family. And I was actually sitting at the grad lounge at William and Mary doing this. And I just remember being like, oh my gosh, is that Mary Lumpkin? Like in this same estate case that is like, you know, on this other woman that I'm studying for a different chapter. So once I found that and realized how much was in those cases, I realized I just had to pursue it further and kind of frame one of the chapters around her, because those estate records did provide so much detail that I couldn't always find in other instances.
Okay, I think we have one more question here from Peter Ratcliffe. Peter, do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Great. Alex, thank you so much. It's such a joy to see this kind of work. And I know that when I did this kind of detailed work, I would feel when I discovered something like the people were alive still, and I was in relationship with them. And it's so great to see what you've done. When I was doing this work, I found the records of the Freedmen's Savings Bank to be a particularly rich resource, allowing me to reconstruct the lives and relationships of freed people. And I wondered, did you look at the Freedmen's Savings Bank, and did those records add to what you were able to say about these women?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I did. I unfortunately didn't find anything. I tried to look at, you know, I did find some in kind of other, like the Freedmen's Bureau records. I found one letter from Karina Omohundro, but, you know, there's always that sense that there's still something out there. And so Robert Colby, who's a historian, actually just emailed me like maybe a month ago that he'd found one of the women involved in some kind of dispute in the Freedmen's Bureau case, and that it's, you know, that case is out there somewhere, right? But it's like, oh, the book's been published. But so I'm sure, you know, that there's still some details to find in some archive somewhere, which is what, you know, keeps me up at night.
Well, I think that that's something we can all relate to, and that seems like an excellent place to leave it. So without further ado, I'd like us all to give Alex a hand and thank her for a great presentation. And folks want to stay around a little bit and chat a little more informally, I'll turn off the record, and that's fine. We can do that for a few minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Alex.